In our empire, love is never the reason a human is chosen. That was the first sentence Princess Lyra Virith heard when she was old enough to understand the law that governed her life. The words had been carved into the black glass pillars of the Hall of Accord 300 years ago, back when the alliance between the Aurelian Empire and Earth was still fragile, back when fear traveled faster than trust across the stars. Tonight those same pillars reflected the light of 1,000 floating lanterns as nobles, diplomats, and observers from dozens of systems gathered beneath the immense silver dome of the capital. The ceremony had not begun yet, but the silence already felt heavy, like the still air before a storm. Princess Lyra stood alone on the elevated platform, her long blue robes drifting softly around her ankles as the climate currents moved through the chamber. Her skin carried the soft glow of her species, a pale blue tone like ocean water under moonlight, and her silver hair was bound high in the ceremonial knot required for heirs to the throne. She looked calm to the crowd watching below. Royal. Untouchable. Inside, she felt something closer to exhaustion. The law of union had been explained to her since childhood. Every heir of the Aurelian line must one day choose a human partner. Not for romance. Not for companionship. For stability. The law had been written after the first human Thalian treaties, when fear of genetic difference had nearly destroyed the fragile peace between worlds. The solution had been simple and brutal: bind the future of the empire to humanity itself. The heir would choose a human from Earth, proving that the two species could stand together. The tradition was celebrated as wisdom by the empire. Lyra had always seen it as something else. A performance. A reminder that even royalty could belong to a law older than their own voice. Below her, the chamber doors opened with a quiet mechanical hum. The chosen humans were being escorted inside. One by one they stepped onto the marble floor beneath the platform. Soldiers with decorated uniforms. Scholars with polished credentials. Entrepreneurs from Earth whose names traveled through trade networks like currency. Each of them had been selected by the Imperial Council as worthy candidates. Each stood straight, aware that an entire empire was watching. Lyra's gaze drifted across them. Slowly. Confident posture. Expensive clothing. Careful smiles practiced for cameras and diplomats. Every one of them looked prepared to be chosen. Then she noticed the man standing at the far edge of the group. He looked as though he had wandered into the ceremony by accident. His jacket was worn at the cuffs, darkened by old engine grease that no amount of washing could completely remove. A simple tool clip hung from his belt as if he had forgotten to take it off before arriving. His boots carried the faint dust of shipping docks. And unlike the others, he was not staring up at the royal platform trying to catch her attention. He was looking around the enormous chamber with quiet curiosity, as if he were studying the architecture instead of participating in the most important ceremony of his life. Lyra leaned forward slightly, her attention narrowing on that single figure. The Empire had offered her warriors, scholars, and legends. But the only person in the room who seemed entirely unimpressed by the moment, was the poorest man standing there. Lyra remained motionless on the high platform while the council chamber slowly settled into silence, the soft glow of floating lanterns reflecting across the polished silver floor beneath her. From above she could see every movement, every nervous shift of posture among the human candidates assembled below. Most of them stood tall with rehearsed confidence, shoulders squared, hands carefully folded as if posing for a portrait that would be remembered across star systems. Their clothing carried the quiet signals of wealth and preparation. Tailored jackets. Perfectly polished boots. Small insignias pinned near their collars that spoke of achievements and titles. They had studied this ceremony, she realized. They knew exactly how to look when an empire was watching. Yet the man at the far edge of the line still seemed unaware that he was part of something historic. He shifted his weight slightly and glanced up at the enormous glass dome that curved nearly 200 feet above the chamber floor, where faint stars shimmered through the transparent alloy panels. His expression held simple curiosity, the same look a traveler might wear inside a museum. Lyra watched him longer than she intended. An imperial advisor stepped quietly beside her, his robe whispering across the polished stone. His voice was low enough that only she could hear. The council reminds you that each candidate has been carefully evaluated. Many are decorated officers or leading scientists from Earth. They represent the finest humanity has to offer. Lyra nodded once, though her gaze had not moved from the man in the worn jacket. The advisor followed her line of sight and paused. That one was not recommended by the council. A worker from the outer docking districts of Earth. His file indicates that he repairs cargo ships and small transport vessels. Minimal academic record. No political value. The advisor hesitated before adding quietly, "In truth, Your Highness, he is here only because the law requires a wide selection." Lyra studied the man again. The faint marks of engine grease on his sleeve told a clearer story than any council file. Someone who worked with machines every day. Someone who used his hands. The ceremony conductor stepped forward at the center of the chamber and raised a slender crystal rod. The faint hum of the building systems faded until the entire hall seemed to hold its breath. "Princess Lyra Virith of the Aurelian Empire," he announced, his voice amplified through hidden resonance fields, "the law now grants you the right to choose." A ripple of anticipation moved through the audience galleries where nobles and diplomats watched from tiered balconies. Cameras drifted silently through the air to capture every second for worlds beyond this one. Lyra descended the curved steps of the platform slowly, each step echoing gently across the vast hall. The candidates straightened immediately as she approached. Some lowered their heads respectfully. Others held her gaze with careful determination. She passed the decorated officers first. Then the scholars. Then the wealthy industrialists whose influence stretched across human colonies. Every one of them seemed ready for the moment she would stop. But Lyra continued walking. The quiet murmur spreading through the audience followed her like a wave. At the far edge of the line the man in the worn jacket finally noticed her approaching. He blinked once in mild surprise, then straightened instinctively as she stopped in front of him. For a moment neither of them spoke. Lyra noticed the small metal tool clipped to his belt. The edges were worn smooth from years of use. "You did not expect to be chosen, did you?" she asked softly. The man gave a small, uncertain smile. "Honestly, ma'am, I was not even sure why I was invited. My supervisor signed the application as a joke." A faint laugh escaped somewhere in the distant crowd, quickly silenced. Lyra studied his face carefully. There was no ambition in his eyes. No calculation. Only quiet honesty. "What is your name?" she asked. "Ethan Walker, ma'am. Cargo repair technician. Dock District 7, Earth." Lyra turned toward the watching empire. Her voice carried calmly across the silent chamber. "Then my choice is clear. I choose Ethan Walker." For a moment the chamber forgot how to breathe. The announcement hung in the air like a dropped piece of glass that had not yet shattered. Cameras hovered silently. Nobles leaned forward in their balcony seats. Advisors exchanged stunned glances that they quickly tried to hide behind professional composure. Ethan Walker blinked once, certain he had misheard. He looked over his shoulder as if the princess might have been pointing to someone standing behind him. But there was no one else there. Just the vast hall, the watching empire, and Princess Lyra standing calmly in front of him. Ethan cleared his throat. "Your Highness," he said carefully, "I think there might be some confusion." Lyra tilted her head slightly, the faint silver strands of her hair catching the lantern light. "There is no confusion." The ceremony conductor stood frozen for half a second before quickly consulting the glowing tablet in his hands. The protocol screens around the chamber flickered as the imperial system recorded the official selection. Murmurs rolled through the audience like distant thunder. Ethan rubbed the back of his neck, leaving a faint smear of grease across his skin. "I mean no disrespect, Your Highness," he said quietly, "but there are a lot of people here who look more qualified than me." Lyra glanced briefly toward the line of candidates behind him. Several of them had gone pale. One of the officers forced a polite smile that looked painfully stiff. "Qualifications were never the purpose of the law," she replied. Ethan looked around again, clearly unsure how to stand or where to place his hands. The polished marble beneath his boots probably cost more than his entire apartment back on Earth. "I repair cargo engines," he said honestly. "Mostly old ones. Sometimes the smaller transport ships that come in from the outer colonies." "That is valuable work," Lyra said. Ethan let out a quiet breath that sounded suspiciously like a nervous laugh. "Sure. If your food shipment breaks down halfway between Mars and Jupiter, I guess somebody has to fix it." A few members of the audience shifted uncomfortably. The Empire was not accustomed to hearing ordinary conversation in the middle of a royal ceremony. Lyra studied Ethan's face again. There was no performance in him. No attempt to impress her. Only simple sincerity. Most of the candidates had looked at her the way people look at a crown or a trophy. Ethan looked at her the way someone might look at a stranger on a train platform. Curious. Respectful. Uncertain. But not intimidated. The ceremony conductor finally found his voice again. "By imperial law," he announced, "the chosen human will now step forward and stand beside the heir of the Aurelian throne." Ethan hesitated. "You are sure about this?" he asked quietly. Lyra gave the smallest nod. After a moment he stepped forward onto the raised platform beside her. From up there the hall looked even larger. Thousands of alien eyes watched them. Ethan leaned slightly toward Lyra and spoke under his breath. "For the record, I was supposed to start a maintenance shift tomorrow morning. My boss is not going to believe this." Lyra felt the faintest hint of amusement tug at the corner of her thoughts. "The Empire may adjust your schedule," she said. Ethan looked out at the silent crowd again, then back at her. "One more honest question," he said. "Why me?" Lyra did not answer immediately. Instead she looked down at the worn tool clipped to his belt. The metal edges had been smoothed by years of real work. Finally she said quietly, "Because you were the only person in this room who did not arrive expecting to be chosen." The ceremony ended with the kind of controlled efficiency that only an ancient empire could perform. Within minutes the towering chamber that had been filled with nobles, cameras, and diplomats began to empty, leaving behind only the quiet hum of the building systems and the faint glow of lanterns slowly dimming overhead. Ethan Walker still stood on the platform beside Princess Lyra, feeling as if the last hour had happened to someone else. A pair of tall attendants approached, their silver uniforms reflecting the light like polished mirrors. One of them bowed respectfully toward Lyra before turning to Ethan. "Mr. Walker, please follow us." Ethan looked at Lyra as if asking silent permission. She gave a small nod. "It is part of the protocol," she said calmly. Ethan stepped down from the platform and followed the attendants through a set of tall doors that opened without a sound. The hallway beyond was quiet and impossibly long, its walls made of a smooth white material that seemed to glow softly from within. Ethan walked carefully across the spotless floor, suddenly aware that his boots still carried the dust of a cargo dock back on Earth. The faint smell of engine oil clung to his jacket. He wondered if anyone here had ever smelled anything like it before. After nearly 2 minutes of walking they entered a private chamber with wide windows that overlooked the sprawling capital city of the Aurelian Empire. Towers of glass and silver stretched for miles across the horizon, connected by elevated bridges and streams of quiet aerial traffic. Ethan stopped near the window and stared out. "Wow," he said softly. "That is about 10,000 times nicer than Dock District 7. The attendant stepped aside as Lyra entered the room behind him. The doors closed quietly, leaving only the two of them and the distant hum of the city far below. Ethan turned, still trying to process the situation. "I hope this is not rude to ask," he said carefully, "but what exactly happens now?" Lyra walked slowly toward the window, her blue skin reflecting the soft afternoon light pouring through the glass. The law requires that the chosen human remain under royal protection while the formal union process is prepared, she explained. Ethan blinked. Union process. That sounds official. It is. Ethan rubbed the back of his neck again. His tool clip bumped lightly against his belt as he shifted his weight. I should probably mention something important then. Lyra looked at him. I am not exactly trained for royal life. My apartment back home is about 400 square feet, and the only people who ever visit are the guys from my repair crew when the power goes out. Lyra studied him quietly. The honesty in his voice carried no embarrassment. Only a simple statement of fact. You believe this palace will be difficult for you, she asked. Ethan let out a small breath of amusement. Difficult is one word for it. I feel like someone dropped a mechanic into the middle of a museum. Lyra looked out across the endless city for a moment before speaking again. That is interesting, she said softly. Ethan frowned slightly. What is? She turned back toward him, her expression thoughtful. You think you are the one who has been taken out of your world? Ethan shrugged. That seems pretty obvious. Lyra folded her hands calmly in front of her. Yet this ceremony has also taken me out of mine. Ethan blinked again. For the first time since arriving, he realized something surprising. The princess who ruled an empire of stars looked just as uncertain about the future as the cargo mechanic standing beside her. The sun of the Aurelian capital was beginning to lower beyond the distant towers, casting long ribbons of gold across the glass walls of the chamber. Ethan Walker stood near the wide window, still trying to accept that the skyline stretching for miles below him now belonged to the world of the woman standing a few feet away. He shifted slightly, hands resting near his belt as he watched a line of silent aerial transports glide between the towers like schools of silver fish. Back on Earth, the busiest thing he usually watched outside a window was a cargo drone bringing parts to Dock District 7. After a moment he glanced sideways at Lyra. She had not moved much since their conversation a few minutes earlier. The princess stood quietly beside the window, her posture straight yet thoughtful, her silver hair catching the soft light of the evening sky. Ethan cleared his throat. So if we are both out of our worlds now, he said, I guess that means we are both improvising. Lyra looked at him, her eyes reflecting the fading sunlight. Improvising is not a concept the Imperial Council enjoys, she replied calmly. Ethan chuckled quietly. Yeah, councils usually do not. That is kind of their whole thing. Lyra watched him with mild curiosity. You speak very openly for someone standing inside a royal palace. Ethan shrugged. I repair broken cargo ships for a living. Most of the time the manual does not help much, so you learn to talk honestly and figure things out as you go. Lyra considered that answer. On Aurelian worlds, people trained for royal protocol spent decades learning the exact opposite. Words were measured. Gestures calculated. Even silence was often rehearsed. Yet, Ethan Walker spoke as if none of those invisible rules existed. She found the difference strangely refreshing. Ethan walked slowly across the chamber, examining the smooth white walls and the strange patterns of light moving across the floor. Do you mind if I ask something else? He said. Lyra gestured lightly. You may ask. Ethan leaned against the edge of a low table that looked like it had been carved from a single piece of crystal. Back during the ceremony, you had a whole line of impressive candidates. Military officers, scientists, business leaders. I saw the way they were standing. They all expected to be chosen. Lyra nodded once. They did. Ethan looked down at the small tool clipped to his belt, brushing a thumb across its worn metal surface. Then why did you really pick the mechanic who showed up in a jacket that still smells like engine coolant? Lyra did not answer immediately. Instead she stepped closer to the window again, watching the distant traffic move between the towers far below. When the council assembled the candidate list, she said quietly, they focused on influence and power. Ethan folded his arms loosely. That sounds about right for a council. Lyra continued, but none of them considered something simpler. Ethan raised an eyebrow. What is that? She turned to face him again. Which of those humans understood how fragile a machine can be? Ethan blinked, surprised by the direction of the conversation. Well, most people who fix things learn that pretty quickly. One small failure can stop an entire system. Exactly, Lyra said softly. The alliance between our species is not unlike a machine. It functions only if someone understands how to repair what breaks. Ethan looked out across the endless alien city again, slowly absorbing the meaning behind her words. After a moment he let out a quiet breath and shook his head slightly. So you picked a repair technician to help maintain peace between two civilizations. Lyra's expression softened almost imperceptibly. It seemed logical. Ethan smiled faintly. You know something, Princess. That might be the strangest job description I have ever heard. The evening lights of the Aurelian capital slowly brightened as the sun disappeared behind the distant horizon, turning the glass towers outside the palace into rivers of silver and blue. Ethan Walker stood near the window with his arms loosely crossed, still studying the alien city stretching for miles in every direction. He had repaired engines on cargo ships that traveled between planets, yet somehow standing inside this palace felt more unreal than drifting between stars. Behind him, Princess Lyra moved quietly across the chamber. Her steps were soft against the smooth floor, almost silent, but Ethan still noticed the movement. Years of working around machinery had trained his ears to catch small changes in sound. He turned slightly as she approached. So, he said with a thoughtful expression, if the Empire picked me because I fix things, I should probably warn you that not everything can be repaired with a wrench and a little patience. Lyra stopped beside the window again and looked out across the glowing skyline. That is true, she replied. Some systems require understanding rather than tools. Ethan nodded slowly. Yeah. Ships are like that too sometimes. A problem looks mechanical at first, but then you realize it is actually the navigation software or a sensor that is giving the wrong data. Lyra glanced at him with quiet interest. You speak about machines the way philosophers speak about society. Ethan laughed softly. Trust me, nobody in Dock District 7 has ever called a mechanic a philosopher. For a moment the room settled into a calm silence. The faint hum of the city outside blended with the low-energy systems inside the palace walls. Ethan noticed something then. On a low table across the chamber sat a small floating display, its surface filled with glowing lines of alien text. Lyra walked toward it and studied the message appearing on the screen. Her expression did not change, but Ethan sensed the shift in the room almost immediately. Bad news, he asked gently. Lyra hesitated for a moment before answering. The council has scheduled the next phase of the union ceremony sooner than expected. Ethan straightened slightly. How soon is sooner? Tomorrow morning, Lyra said. Ethan blinked. Tomorrow. That seems fast. The law values efficiency, Lyra replied quietly. Ethan rubbed his chin, thinking. Back on Earth, whenever someone rushed a repair job, it usually meant they were nervous about something. After a moment he spoke again. Are they worried about your choice? Lyra looked back toward the glowing city outside the window. The council believes stability requires predictability. Ethan nodded slowly. And choosing the mechanic instead of the decorated heroes was not exactly predictable. No, Lyra said calmly. It was not. Ethan walked toward the window again and looked out at the endless towers glowing in the night. For a long moment he said nothing. Then he spoke quietly, almost to himself. You know something. On the docks we have a saying when a machine starts making strange noises. Lyra glanced at him. What saying? Ethan folded his arms and gave a small thoughtful smile. It means something interesting is about to happen. Morning arrived over the Aurelian capital with a pale silver light that slowly spread across the endless towers outside the palace. The city woke quietly. Streams of aerial transports moved through the sky like organized constellations while the first glow of the rising star reflected across the glass bridges connecting the buildings. Inside the palace, Ethan Walker stood on a balcony nearly 300 feet above the ground, resting his hands on the smooth railing as he looked out across the unfamiliar world. He had slept very little. The guest chamber they had given him was larger than his entire apartment back on Earth, with walls that adjusted their color automatically to match the sunrise. Every surface had been spotless, silent, almost too perfect. Ethan had spent half the night sitting near the window, wondering if the repair crew back in Dock District 7 had already noticed he had not shown up for his shift. Behind him, the balcony doors opened with a quiet whisper. Ethan turned slightly as Princess Lyra stepped outside. She wore a simple royal robe this morning, deep blue instead of the ceremonial silver from the previous day. Without the formal crown or the large audience watching her, she looked different. Less like a symbol of an empire and more like a person who had also been awake thinking through the night. Ethan gave a small nod. "Morning, Princess." Lyra stepped beside him and looked out across the city. "Good morning, Ethan Walker." For a moment they both watched the skyline in silence. Then Ethan gestured toward the horizon where a large cluster of towers rose like shining mountains. "That the government district?" he asked. Lyra nodded. "The Imperial Council chamber is located in the tallest structure." Ethan studied it carefully. Back on Earth, the largest buildings he ever worked near were cargo warehouses maybe 200 feet high. The tower Lyra pointed toward looked closer to. "Half a mile. So that is where the people who are nervous about my existence are meeting right now." Lyra did not answer immediately, but her eyes moved briefly toward the same tower. "They are discussing the implications of the ceremony." Ethan let out a quiet breath. "Yeah. That sounds like a polite way to say it." Lyra turned to him slightly. "You do not appear frightened by this situation." Ethan shrugged. "I fix engines for a living. When a machine breaks down in deep space you either panic or you start solving problems. Panic has never repaired anything." Lyra considered that. "And what problem do you believe we are facing?" Ethan looked back toward the distant council tower again, then down at the busy streets nearly 300 feet below them. After a moment he answered honestly. "I think the council expected you to pick someone they could predict. Someone powerful. Someone easy to control." Lyra did not disagree. Ethan continued. "Instead you picked the guy who fixes cargo engines and forgets to remove a wrench from his belt before attending an interstellar ceremony." Lyra allowed the faintest hint of a smile. "That is an accurate description." Ethan rested his arms on the railing again. "Which means the council is probably trying to figure out whether I am a mistake or a threat." Lyra studied his expression carefully. "And what do you believe you are?" Ethan thought about the question for a few seconds before answering. "Just a mechanic, Princess. The kind who notices when a system starts making strange noises." He looked back toward the enormous council tower once more, watching the sunlight climb slowly across its glass surface. "And right now, this entire empire sounds like a machine that has started to rattle." The morning air above the palace balcony carried a faint metallic coolness, the kind of crisp atmosphere that came from a city built high above the planet's lower cloud layers. Ethan Walker remained leaning on the smooth railing, watching the distant council tower while streams of aerial traffic moved silently through the sky between the shining buildings. Princess Lyra stood beside him, calm and thoughtful, though her attention had shifted toward the small communication device that now hovered near her shoulder. A thin beam of light projected from it, forming a message written in flowing Aurelian symbols. Lyra studied the message for a moment. Before speaking quietly. "The council has completed its discussion." Ethan straightened slightly. "That was fast." Lyra nodded once. "They have requested our presence." Ethan glanced back toward the distant tower that dominated the skyline. The structure looked even larger in the bright daylight, its reflective sides catching the rising sun like a blade of glass reaching half a mile into the sky. "Let me guess," he said calmly. "They want to make sure the mechanic understands the rules of the palace." Lyra deactivated the message field with a small motion of her hand. "Something like that." Ethan exhaled slowly and stepped away from the railing. "Well, if they are hoping I will suddenly turn into a diplomat, they are probably going to be disappointed." Lyra looked at him with quiet curiosity. "Why do you say that?" Ethan brushed a thumb across the worn metal edge of the tool clipped to his belt. "Because every time someone tries to talk like a machine manual instead of a person, something important usually gets missed." Lyra considered that as they walked back into the chamber. The palace corridors were already active with quiet movement as attendants prepared for the next stage of the ceremony. Soft lights glowed along the curved walls, guiding them toward a waiting transport platform. A sleek shuttle waited there, its surface polished to a mirror shine. Ethan slowed slightly as he approached it. "That is our ride?" he asked. "Yes," Lyra said. "The council chamber is nearly 12 miles across the capital." Ethan whistled softly. Back home, a 12-mile commute usually means a broken subway line and a very long walk. Lyra stepped into the transport first, followed by Ethan. The door closed with a gentle sound and the craft lifted smoothly into the air. Within seconds the palace had become a distant structure behind them. The city stretched below like an endless grid of silver towers and luminous bridges. Ethan looked out the window as they flew toward the enormous council building ahead. "You know," he said after a moment, "I have been thinking about something you said yesterday." Lyra turned slightly. "About repairing fragile systems?" Ethan nodded. "Yeah. If the alliance between our species is really like a machine, then the council is acting like a group of engineers who are afraid to open the panel and see what is actually inside." Lyra studied the horizon. As the council tower slowly grew larger through the window. "They fear uncertainty," she said quietly. Ethan smiled faintly. "Funny thing about uncertainty. That is usually where the real solution is hiding." The transport began to descend toward a wide landing platform halfway up the massive tower. Hundreds of feet below, the capital moved in quiet harmony. As the shuttle settled gently onto the platform, Ethan took one last look at the city before turning toward the door. "Well, Princess," he said calmly, "I guess it is time to meet the people who think a mechanic might break their empire." The council chamber was larger than Ethan Walker expected. The transport door opened into a circular hall nearly 500 feet wide, its ceiling rising high above like the inside of a glass dome. Sunlight poured through the transparent surface, scattering across polished floors that reflected the figures standing in the center of the room. 12 members of the Imperial Council stood in a quiet ring, their tall forms wrapped in formal robes that shimmered with subtle light. Each one watched as Princess Lyra and the human mechanic stepped forward together. Ethan noticed immediately that the chamber was silent in a very deliberate way. No whispering attendants. No moving guards. Just the quiet hum of the structure itself. The kind of silence that appears when everyone is waiting for something important to happen. Lyra stopped at the center of the circle. Ethan remained beside her, his posture relaxed but attentive. One of the council members stepped forward slightly. The figure was older than the others, their silver robes marked with patterns that shifted slowly like moving constellations. "Human Ethan Walker," the council member said, "your presence here has created significant discussion within this chamber." Ethan gave a small nod. "I get that reaction sometimes when I walk into places where people are wearing robes and I am still carrying a wrench." A faint ripple moved through the circle of council members. Not laughter exactly, but something close to curiosity. The elder counselor continued. "Our laws required the princess to select a human partner to symbolize unity between our civilizations. Many candidates were available. Decorated explorers. Scientists. Leaders. Yet she selected you. A mechanic from a trade station nearly 40 light-years away. Ethan shrugged lightly. Yeah. I noticed that too. The elder counselor studied him carefully. Our concern is not your profession. It is unpredictability. Systems that endure must remain stable. Ethan looked slowly around the enormous chamber, his eyes moving from one council member to the next before finally glancing upward at the glass dome high above them. Back on Earth, he said thoughtfully, machines fail for two main reasons. The council waited silently. Ethan continued. One reason is damage. Something breaks. Something wears out. That is easy to see. But the second reason is more interesting. The system becomes so rigid that it cannot adjust anymore. When something new happens, it snaps. The chamber remained completely still. Ethan rested his hands loosely at his sides. You built an empire that spans star systems. That is impressive. But the moment you start believing only predictable choices are safe, you stop discovering anything new. The elder counselor turned slightly toward Princess Lyra. Your reasoning, Princess. Lyra stepped forward calmly. The law required a human partner. It did not require the safest choice. It required the correct one. The elder counselor observed Ethan again. And what makes this human correct? Lyra answered without hesitation. He sees systems as living things. Not machines that must remain frozen. Ethan glanced sideways at her, slightly surprised by the certainty in her voice. The council members exchanged quiet looks with one another. Finally the elder counselor spoke again. Human Ethan Walker. If the union proceeds, you will stand beside the future ruler of this empire. Do you understand the responsibility? Ethan thought about the question for a moment. Then he smiled in the calm, practical way of someone who had spent years repairing complicated engines in cold cargo bays. Yeah, he said gently. I understand something simpler. The counselor tilted their head slightly. Explain. Ethan looked around the vast chamber one more time before answering. Every machine needs someone who is not afraid to open the panel and listen to how it really sounds. For the first time since entering the chamber, the silence that followed felt different. Not tense. Not uncertain. Just thoughtful.